Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2024 documentary Brats. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this film, I would like to give a special shout out to Mega Pork Chop Express for requesting this review. And I also want to thank him for being a longtime supporter of my channel. And I also want to apologize for the delay when it comes to this particular request. And I hope it was ultimately worth the wait for you. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you'd like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, Brats is a documentary directed by one of the members of the Brat Pack, Andrew McCarthy. It's inspired by a piece that he wrote where he was trying to grapple with the term Brat Pack and the impact that it had on his life and his career. And so he decided to turn it into a documentary. And this is an interesting film. I don't think it's necessarily a great film, but it's an interesting movie. In a lot of ways, it's less of a documentary about the Brat Pack and more of a way for Andrew McCarthy to find some catharsis all these years later in regards to how he has felt about the term Brat Pack and how it's been something that's really bothered him throughout all these years. So in a lot of ways, it's kind of just a long therapy session for Andrew McCarthy. And I could see how that could rub some people the wrong way. They might see it as just a really shallow vanity project. But I didn't really feel that way about it because I think that there were some things that were genuinely interesting and fascinating about this documentary. There were some insights that were brought up that I didn't necessarily really know about. And there is something to be said about Andrew McCarthy tracking down these other members of the Brat Pack and talking to them and getting their thoughts on the Brat Pack phenomenon and what it meant to them and what the term did for their careers or for their lives, positive or negative. And the negative connotation in particular is very heavily discussed and explored in this documentary, and it's something that I did not even know existed. I didn't know that Brat Pack was a negative thing. I always thought that it was a positive thing, but it really wasn't. The article that coined the term Brat Pack was very dismissive of Andrew McCarthy and the other young actors who were starting to come up and really make a name for themselves in that time. So a term that's become endearing now really wasn't an endearing term for a lot of the people who were a part of the Brat Pack and for a lot of people who were in the industry, because it just kind of created a certain aura around these actors that was not really the best, and really kind of painted them as actors who weren't necessarily the most professional, and actors who were more about being celebrities and getting free dinners and tickets and all this other stuff that comes with fame, and it makes it really seem like they're not serious actors. And you can definitely see that that's something that definitely left a mark on these actors in their, honestly, in their primes, just about to break out, and it affected them in ways that I didn't even know. I didn't even know that it had that kind of effect on the careers of Andrew McCarthy and Emilio Estevez and Rob Lowe. And so I really do appreciate Andrew for providing that different perspective. But I think that this would have been a more effective documentary if there was a different director. Andrew McCarthy, I'm not going to sit here and say that he did a bad job directing it, but you can definitely tell that this is a guy who's not really a director. And so it has this very kind of, I don't know if amateur is the right word, but inexperienced. Very, amateur is maybe a little too harsh, but there's a lot of inexperience here, kind of fly by the seat of your pants directing. And at times it kind of works, and other times though it's jarring. For instance, he does this thing where he will shoot some scenes with a film camera and then some other scenes with some old camcorder from like the 90s, and then shoot scenes in HD with like a 4K camera. And then he'll go back and forth between all three of these different formats. And I just felt that that was interesting initially, but then as it continued on, it just became more of a distraction. I'm like, okay, pick a style, direct it like it's a 4K HD high-end documentary, or direct it like it's some old 90s camcorder thing. Like there was a whole documentary about young stars, young actors. I think it was called Kid 90 or something. It was about 90s kids, and I'm trying to remember. I think it was Tiffany was involved with it, and I think there was some other 90s teen or tween stars that were interviewed as adults for that documentary, because it was a lot of home movies. And so a lot of it was home movies, so it made sense that a lot of the other stuff was also kind of shot in a way to kind of connect with the home movies. And I thought that was definitely an interesting aesthetic. And I think if you wanted to do something like that, that would have worked for this, because there's a lot of old footage that they use, like interviews with Molly Ringwald or Judd Nelson or some of these other Brat Pack members. Or so I think that could have worked. Or shoot it like a film. That could have been interesting too. Shoot it with film and then cut back to, the other clips of the Breakfast Club and St. Elmo's Fire and so on and so forth. But trying to do all three of those things, it was just a bit much. Also, there are way too many shots in this where you can see the cameramen. And I know that's a choice, but it's a way too bold of a choice for my tastes, and it just is very distracting. So you have an interview, for instance, with Andrew McCarthy and director Howard Dutch, who directed Pretty in Pink, and then you see like two different cameramen in the background. It's distracting. It takes you out of it. It doesn't really make the film better. It makes it worse. And there's multiple other moments throughout the film where you can clearly tell that Andrew's trying to set up a shot. So it'll be at a weird angle, and then he'll like fix it, and you'll see him fix it in the actual final cut. It just makes it look unprofessional. Like it doesn't make it look like introspective or fresh or realistic, or it just makes it look unprofessional. So that's why I honestly feel this would have been better with the more established and accomplished documentary filmmaker, and then have Andrew just be the star. That this filmmaker, this documentary uh, uh, professional, just follows around on his journey to try to reunite and reconnect with the Brat Pack, and to come to terms with the term itself, and to hopefully find a way to move on and actually appreciate the term after all these years. And Andrew is definitely responsible as well for a lot of the structure of it, and it can be a little scattershot as well, because a lot of it is just, it's really framed around Andrew's interviews with these other various different members of the Brat Pack, and a little bit of some history on the term, and a little bit of a look and a glimpse of at that time period of film, when all these young actors were starting to get all these chances and all these movies, and they were becoming hit films, and that led to a changing of the guard in Hollywood, where they were focusing more on these films for younger audiences. And so you have all these different interviews between Andrew McCarthy and other people in the industry, like Emilio Estevez, which is, it was nice to see Emilio, but the interview itself was awkward. You just, there's this tension between Andrew and Emilio that it was awkward. It was really awkward, to be honest. Um, Andrew also interviews Ali Sheedy, Timothy Hutton, Demi Moore, Rob Lowe, Leah Thompson, John Cryer. He also interviews producer Lauren Schuler Donner, Howard Dutch, David Blum, the journalist who actually coined the term Brat Pack and started this whole turmoil for Andrew and for his colleagues in the industry. Because as soon as that term became viral, became a thing, he tried to do everything that he possibly could to distance himself from the Brat Pack, and so did all the other members. You find out in the interview with Emilio that Emilio and Andrew were going to do a film together, and it was a script that they really liked. It was something about a professional young a man, in business. Maybe something along the lines of like Secret of My Success or something like that. And it was a script that they really, really liked, and they thought that it could be a genuinely great movie, and a lot of people involved with the film, and they were looking forward to it. They thought it could be a huge hit, and Emilio and Andrew dropped out, and then they just never really even tried to go back to the idea. And I didn't know that. Like, that would have been, I would have loved to have seen that. A film in the 80s starring Emilio Estevez and Andrew McCarthy together, and they're the two leads. That would have been really cool. But we didn't get that because of the Brat Pack thing and the stigma that was associated with it. And a lot of the interviews, they don't necessarily, there's not a lot of depth to these interviews. A lot of it just seems like it's structured around Andrew and his thoughts and what he wants to hear, and not necessarily what the audience might want to hear in terms of answers to things. You want to hear more from these members of the Brat Pack when it comes to their time in the industry during this era of filmmaking and their experiences, and how they managed to move beyond the term Brat Pack or embrace it. And in some ways you get that, but in a lot of ways you don't. So it's just kind of, I don't know if superficial is the right word, but it definitely isn't necessarily as cohesive or as deep of a conversation as you might expect for a film that's trying to be introspective in this kind of way. But it was still nice to see and to hear these voices. It was nice to hear Ali Sheedy and just see her talk endearingly about her time in Hollywood, and her role in the Breakfast Club, and how much it means to her and to other people and other young people who look up to her and see themselves in her, and how she is able to reminisce along with Andrew McCarthy about the times when they just drove together in Allie's Jeep, and they were just enjoying life. Stuff like that was rather endearing, and I like that. And so was the interview between Andrew and Timothy Hutton, and there was a lot of stuff with these interviews where it definitely had a certain extra layer to it because of the fact that Andrew hadn't talked to a lot of these people for decades. So there was this extra level of nostalgia that was happening, where the audience is not only being nostalgic, but so is the focus of the documentary and Andrew McCarthy. So the audience is nostalgic because they're seeing the clips and stuff, and seeing all the different interviews, and hearing from John Hughes and old interviews, and all of that. And then you have Andrew seeing Emilio Estevez for the first time in 30 years, or Timothy Hutton, or Demi Moore and Rob Lowe, and the Demi Moore interview, I think, was and the Rob Lowe one. I think those were the two best ones for me because of the perspective that Demi and Rob provided. They found a way to kind of get past Andrew's insecurities and his inherent problem with the term brat pack, and get him to think about it differently, and to really get him to have this realization that it's not necessarily a bad thing. And of course, he is able to elucidate and communicate to the audience that it was a bad thing for him initially, and it was understandably a bad thing because it was a distraction. It labeled him and put him in a hole. It put him in a bind. It put him in a particular box at a point in his career where he was just starting to really hit his stride. And so it was a shock. It was as if his direction in his career was just altered without his control. And you sympathize with him. You do. You feel for Andrew, and you feel for the other members of the Brat Pack when it comes to this thing that was completely out of their control in regards to this article and this term, the Brat Pack, and the damage that it did. It did. It led to them not getting recognized, or not getting considered for a multitude of different film roles that they might have been otherwise, because of the stigma that was associated with this term, at least early on. Like, as soon as that article came out in the New York Magazine, and it was like a runaway smash success when it comes to articles, and the term Brat Pack stuck, there were a lot of agents that had to fight for these actors, and didn't necessarily win these battles with some of these more established filmmakers, talking about how, you're not going to get that Martin Scorsese role, you're not going to get that Steven Spielberg role, because of this connotation that's associated with you now, that you're a member of the Brat Pack. And I know it's a simplistic thing, but when you hear Andrew McCarthy and other members of the Brat Pack talk about how initially they were just upset by being labeled as a brat, you get it. Because it isn't really one of those things where they're able to look at it as something that they can own and utilize for extra publicity, or make their stars even bigger and even brighter. They look at it at face value, as if somebody's telling them that they're brats. That's a nasty thing when you think about it. And so is like the article, like the content of it. It's not kind at all to these young actors. It's having this condescending tone, and it's talking about their performances and their abilities as if they are not that impressive or bad, and they're more cast for their looks, and because they're a certain age and they can appeal to a certain demographic instead of necessarily their talents. So yeah, it's a pretty dismissive and demeaning article. And that's the article that coined the term Brat Pack. And that leads to a pretty contentious interview with David Blum, the journalist, who, I know, Andrew, from what you see in the film, it seems like he's trying the best he can to smooth things over with this guy, but you kind of still sense the tension. And when you hear David Blum's reasoning, he sounds like he's full of shit. Like, Andrew McCarthy's trying to get him to apologize for being too terse, for being too dismissive, for being just downright mean and nasty for no reason. And the guy's coming up with all these excuses. well, I was 29 years old, and oh, I don't want to look at things like that, and do anything differently because mistakes are what help guide you or down the right paths in life and shape you, and I'm just like, just apologize for being kind of a dick. That's really all that he was asking. He was like, hey, can you apologize to me for being so dismissive of me and my colleagues in this article that really caused a significant amount of damage when it comes to our careers and our career paths. And he's just like, nah, I stand by it. I thought it was funny. I thought it was a good term, and I'm proud of my art. I'm proud of the article. And hey, it's endured after all of this time. And who knew that we would be talking to one another? It was just like it did. It seemed like he was just coming with every excuse in the book to basically not apologize to Andrew McCarthy. So the guy just came across like a prick to me, to be honest. And that might have been the way that McCarthy framed the interview. And I think there are some moments where he's trying to soften the edges a little bit, but the damage was done for me. And I was just like, this guy is just full of it. He's got his head up his own ass. And it's understandable because that's how a lot of journalists are. Um, and speaking of journalists and people with their heads up their asses, there's a lot of just unneeded filler in this documentary too. Interviews with like pop culture historians that add nothing to the movie. There's like this one gal that I was okay with because she wrote a book about the Brat Pack and how it shaped her her life or inspired her, and how it inspires all these other people, and when it comes to these coming of age movies, and I was okay with that. That perspective was fine because at least it's from the perspective of a fan. But when you get like the perspective of like some pop culture historian who's talking about how John Hughes's films in the 80s were uh, uh, basically racist because there isn't really a lot of racial representation, and it reflects the time period where African American culture and African Americans were just considered to be non-existent, which is not entirely accurate if you really look at 80s films and you break things down. And but yes, it is one of those things where the representation isn't necessarily as much as it is now, but it is a product of its time, and times were different then. And then the guy tries to kind of say that, but it just came across like, why are we doing this? What does this have to do with this documentary about the Brat Pack and about how the label uh um has impacted the people who were a part of it, and why it's endured after all these years? That has nothing to do with it. And the worst one was this guy who was another pop culture critic. And I this had to be just, let's get this guy in here so we can get brownie points. Um because this was released on Hulu and through Disney. And so you get this guy, Ira Madison. And by the way, the other guy who was talking about the history was Malcolm Gladwell, who's this author. And so you get Ira Madison III, who's a pop culture critic. And his whole thing is basically talking about how, yeah, those John Hughes movies, those Brat Pack films, I saw them when I was younger. And I was able to relate to Molly Ringwald despite the fact that she was white. And then you're like, okay, that's fine, but then has to go on and have this whole spiel about how all these 80s movies were racist and they didn't have any proper representation in terms of different races, and it was all white people. And then mentions how, well, today there's more representation in media, but it's still predominantly white. And I'm like, why did we have to even discuss this in this Brat Pack documentary? What does this have to do with the Brat Pack? Nothing. It has nothing to do with it. And it just was distracting, just like seeing cameramen in the shot. I was like, what? Why are we on this tangent? This has nothing to do with anything. And it just seemed like it's one of those things that was thrown in there. So I guess Andrew could say, "Hey, my documentary is not just frivolous fluff. Like there's some actual content about it, subtext and about society." It's like we're talking about the Brat Pack. Who cares about that? That should not even be a thing. It shouldn't even come to the forefront at any point in any discussion when it comes to this particular documentary. This has nothing to do with it. So yeah, I definitely didn't like that tangent at all. And yeah, there is a certain disappointment because, Molly Ringwald and Judd Nelson, they don't agree to do interviews, and that's their choice, and that's fine. But it does make things feel incomplete. And they go out of their way to interview these fringe Brat Pack members like Leah Thompson, that was a fun interview, especially when she admits that she's a fan of physical media, which I thought was awesome. Although she was saying something along the lines of nobody buys movies anymore, nobody owns them, and I'm like, you're not talking to me or a good chunk of my audience who watches these videos. But I see where she's coming from. But she talked about, we were a part of the generation that first was able to rent and to own these movies and watch them over and over and over again. And that was a good point to make. And it was just another thing that made her even cooler, that she's a fan of physical media. And John Cryer's interviewed, and he has the whole thing where he's like, I'm not a part of the Brat Pack. And I was kind of surprised, though, that they didn't get Anthony Michael Hall, because he's always considered to be a fringe Brat Pack member. And they not only don't interview him, but he's not mentioned at all, which is kind of surprising. But yeah, it's just one of those documentaries where there isn't as much substance as you would necessarily want from this, but it still winds up being something worth your while for the journey. To see the interviews with these other Brat Pack members all these years later, to see all the new revelations that Andrew McCarthy is experiencing through these interviews, it really helps you get to know Andrew McCarthy on a deeper and more personal level, which is something that you don't really see a lot of actors do a ton of times, where they really are able to show themselves like an open book as much as Andrew does in this. And because he shows all different types of aspects of his personality, and he shows different sides of him. He shows his frustration when he's having a hard time getting these interviews. He shows how the Brat Pack label has genuinely caused him a lot of pain, and has been something that's been bothering and eating away at him for many, many, many years. And you see him grappling with that, and it was legitimately refreshing to see a celebrity in this light, and to also see these celebrities talk to their friend or their colleague, and give them a different perspective, and provide a bit of therapy, really, because that's really ultimately what this is. This whole documentary is therapy for Andrew McCarthy, and not necessarily for, fans of these Brat Pack films, because they didn't necessarily feel like it was a derogatory term or it was a damaging term, but it definitely, I think, opened some eyes for people that weren't necessarily aware of the context of the Brat Pack label. And I think for that reason alone, and the interviews with the other actors, I think it's definitely worth at least one watch. I mean, the cinematography by Adrian Boothuis and Evans Brown is okay. So is the editing by Tony Kent. And it's like 90 something minutes, so it's not like it's 2 hours long or anything. So it's not particularly that long in the tooth. but a lot of it is archival footage, archival interviews. A lot of it is interviews with different people, and some of them make points that don't make any sense in the context of the documentary. So it's just one of those films where, yeah, it is a little underwhelming, like I said, but at the same time, there are worse documentaries out there about pop culture or about nostalgic aspects of history, specifically film history. So there's worse films out there. This isn't like Room 237, for instance, with a bunch of conspiracy theorists babbling about bullshit conspiracy theories in regards to The Shining. So you're not getting that kind of experience here. So that's a good thing, but it's definitely not like one of the best documentaries of the year, and it's not on par with other stuff like, the Robert Englund documentary or some of those other meteor documentaries that deal with celebrities. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on Brats, and until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.